Hi, and welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year police career across 3 different police forces. This is episode 63. Thanks for coming back if you're returning, and if not, welcome for the first time. Hopefully you've been enjoying them so far and you've heard about all sorts of things. Apologies for the sound last week. I was trying to make it better. I think the volume was better, but unfortunately some sort of crazy clicking seemed to creep into the recording. I'm still trying to get it right. Hopefully it didn't ruin it too much for you last week. This one, fingers crossed, should be better, but we'll see. By all means, give us feedback. Reached a bit of a milestone for the channel this week. The time you hear this, we'll have 15,000 downloads in total, which is incredible. So thanks for that, and some good comments as well as good downloads this week. So thank you again. So yeah, episode 63. We're going to talk about another quite a high-profile case. This is about the missing person, Alice Gross, a 14-year-old female who lived in Hanwell in West London. And this is what turned into one of the biggest searches in the Met Police since at the time, the July 2005 suicide bombings. It ended up involving 600 officers from 8 different forces, which is pretty unprecedented. We talked about mutual aid before, where forces, help each other out with resources, and particularly sort of specialist resources like firearms or search or public order. It's very, very rare for the Met to request mutual aid. It's almost always the other way around, because the Met is the biggest force in the country and has, some 35,000 officers. I think that's increased now. So, if you can imagine a smaller force, a county force might only have 3,000 people in it. So if they get a high profile missing person or something where they need specialist resources, it's quite often that, they're requested from the Met, not the other way around. So, excuse me. This was a bit different. Alice went missing on the 28th of August 2014. She came from a decent background, seemingly a decent background, good family in a good area. Not that makes any difference. And she was one of many of hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are reported missing in the London area every year. And initially, people perhaps believe that police don't take them seriously. But I think, when you're getting so many every day, and the vast majority are sort of resolved very, very quickly, perhaps you do become a little bit jaded. But this one started off much the same as any others. And then continue on. So a form would have been taken, details, they'll obtain a photo, and they start some initial inquiries. Obviously the age, she's 14, she was suffering from anorexia, and physically she was tiny, so she was quite recognisable in terms of putting out stuff in press releases as it advanced. We became involved. This is the Met Police dive team that I was on at the time, fairly early on, because her rucksack, which was confirmed to be her rucksack, was discovered by the River Brent in West London. And we were initially asked to start a search on that river. That river, at the point where the rucksack was, not very wide, maybe 20 metres across, something like that, and around a metre to a metre and a half deep, something like that. Again, it varies because of, floodwater, drought, rains, etc. But so initially it wasn't really a dive, it was what we call a wade search, which we've not discussed much yet, but that's basically where you get a line of officers effectively across the river, shoulder to shoulder, and you are walking along. It's for big items, i.e. bodies, so you are looking to pretty much trip over that body is how you're going to find them. And it's for when the water is, kind of waist deep, maybe a little bit deeper, but any deeper than that, it becomes a dive. So a wade search is used in those shallower environments. You're clearly not going to get a sort of a normal search officer in there because they don't have the kit or the training. But it was something we did a lot of for bigger items, and I say items, but bodies. So that was what we started off initially, a wade search. Now, normally, if we were set parameters by a POLSA, a police search advisor, we would always complete them. And very occasionally, they would change during the search because of new information that came in. And that's exactly what happened. We hadn't completed our search of the River Brent, or this particular part, when a fresh sighting came in of Alice, and they'd seen her on CCTV at the nearby Grand Union Canal, which sort of links up with the River Brent. The River Brent flows into it. And there also appeared to be a male on CCTV that may have been following her on a mountain bike. And combined with that, her age, and now she'd been missing for sort of, a couple of days, it all started to ramp up a bit in seriousness. And slowly, as the search continued, this became such a major operation that the Met did what it does very well when it comes to these things, is it set up effectively a base camp which just grew and grew. So initially a car park was commandeered, and then some waste ground, and there was a rest area put in for officers. And then anyone who served in the Met will know about Teapot 1, which is the call sign for basically what initially is a kind of a tea wagon, if you like, that comes along and can serve you, the basics, a bacon roll and a cup of tea for these things that go on for days, and you've got officers out for hours. It's much easier to feed and sort of rest them at the scene rather than sending them back and forward and losing all that time. But as this one grew, it became huge. We ended up with big marquees, big tents up. Teapot 1 turned into nigh on a full canteen. It was feeding hundreds of officers every day. So it really grew, and of course a lot of press interest as well. And it became a massive beast effectively. And we were diving or searching of some descriptions. Eventually it built up to 7 days a week. Unusually, and then they would just rotate us round so that you got the odd day off here and there, but the team would be out for 7 days, sort of 12-hour days. And this was the height of summer. This was right at the end of August, so it was very, very hot from what I remember. So it was pretty hard work. When they looked at the detectives, obviously went away and looked at the various evidence, and particularly this male that they didn't like the look of cycling along the towpath. This was turned out to be a guy they identified as Arnis Zalcans, a Latvian national, and he entered the UK around about 2007, they believed. Unfortunately, and I'm not going to get into the politics of why this did or didn't happen, but clearly a failing, he was allowed into the country, but in June 98, he was convicted of stabbing his wife to death in Latvia, and burying her basically in a shallow grave in some woods. That didn't come out, unfortunately, because that probably would have stopped him coming into the country. And then after he arrived here in 2007, a couple of years later in 2009, he was investigated for an indecent assault on a 14-year-old girl. That was dropped because she declined to make statements, and that's very frustrating for the police, because if the evidence is good enough, you want to proceed with this. It's not a question of somebody saying, well, I don't want to support police in the prosecution and therefore I'm backing out of the situation. Because if that's the case, nowadays they will run those jobs, because we had a real issue years ago when I first joined with women particularly, backing out of domestic violence cases all the time. And we could never get convictions against those guys. So eventually the rules were changed so that we could run those jobs without them. But you do need to get an initial witness statement. Now, this was a 14-year-old girl, that was believed to be involved in this indecent assault. And I suspect, very scared, and various reasons why she didn't want to give her statement, perhaps embarrassment as well, depending on what happened to her. So without that initial statement and some form of evidence, you're going to really struggle to take that forward. And unfortunately, that's what happened. So Zalcans effectively got away with that one, if it was him. So yes, unfortunately, you've got this previous conviction of a murder, and now this indecent assault on a 14-year-old girl. He had moved into an address in West London, and that address was owned by a registered paedophile, somebody who was very well known to the police for an interest in young girls. He began living in that house, and unfortunately, no doubt, that probably only served to, increase his interest in young girls, which was going to clearly become a huge problem later on. And in fact, around about 1 week after Alice went missing initially, Zalcans was then reported missing himself, and later on it became clear as to why that had happened. So the search continued on using all these different resources and a mixture of diving and wading, and we were continually moved around to different locations. There's a lot of sort of marshy land, rivers, streams, canals in that area, and we would be constantly moved between locations. It wasn't normally how we worked. Normally we would always complete a search of a particular area before we moved on, but very high profile case, lots of big bosses involved, and as soon as there was a potential new sighting, you know, they would move you on. It became even more concerning because after a while they found some more CCTV of somebody who they believed to be Zalcans at the time, and he seemed on the footage to have from the knee down on both his legs sort of what could have been damp trousers. His trousers were a lot darker than the upper half of his trousers, suggesting they might be wet. And obviously that caused us great concern and only increased the sort of urgency to search those those rivers, ponds, lakes, canals, etc. But it was a massive task, and it was clear that one dive team just wasn't going to cut it. So again, in total unprecedented times, and I've never heard of it before or since, we actually got mutual aid in from other dive teams around the country. Now, up until then, and it still goes on now, I believe, we used to have regional dives where we would meet up with other dive teams from other forces, and we would host them for a few days of diving, and then the following year a different team would then host us as well as the other sort of 5 or 6 teams. So every year we got together for a few days, the 5 or 6 dive teams in the sort of southeast area, and worked together, and trained together and set up little exercises for each other. And we intermingled the teams. I would go and work with Devon and Cornwall, and Avon and Somerset would come and work with us, and we'd mix it up because every team dived slightly differently, although we stuck to sort of national rules of how things are done. Everyone had their own sort of take slightly on things, and it was very good. And it was just for this scenario that should we ever have to work together, and we always envisaged it would be them calling us to help, not the other way around. But sure enough, we called on all of them to come down for this search, and in the end we had 5 dive teams on this search, which is, as I say, absolutely unheard of. It's certainly not happened since. And normally, I think we've discussed before, for example, when you're searching a canal, it would be done either a wade search, or if it was deeper, which canals generally are, it'd be a dive. Quite a slow process, even for a body. If you're arc searching, which is a fast search compared to the fingertip searching of a single diver jack stay, it still takes a while. And if you've got miles and miles of canals to search, now people would say, well, why don't you empty those canals? You have to remember these are working canals with lots of boat activity up and down, both commercially and sort of for leisure purposes. And they're in use all the time, so we just wouldn't be in a position to empty those canals. Well, we wouldn't normally, but on this occasion there was one piece of canal that we were particularly interested in, and they worked out that even with the 5 teams kind of working round the clock, it was just going to take too long to cover it all. So the decision was made to drain that piece of canal, and in fact I'll put a photo on of the episode of that canal, that empty canal basin, and there was, I think in the photo there's something like 3 or 4 separate dive teams there, all on our hands and knees doing a search across this particular canal. Unheard of, caused a lot of disruption, but clearly for a job like this, you're going to pull out all the stops. We really wanted to find this girl, although unfortunately the more seasoned of us realised it now was unlikely that we were going to find her alive. So certainly we wanted to find her, and then we also wanted to find enough evidence to put away whoever was responsible for her going missing. So it continued on, and we also used and made great use, in fact, of the death dogs, or the cadaver dogs, or cadaver dogs, however you want to say it. These were dogs, I've talked about this in previous episodes, but they're trained specifically to detect death. Basically, they're trained on death, and I talked again about how we trained for that. Effectively, they were trained with pieces of pork soaked in human blood, and we worked with them quite a lot to sort of get them to be able to detect that deeper and deeper in the water, where they were used hugely during this search. And we did find they were very, very good, but we did find a bit of a shortcoming, and that is that they'll show you where death is, but of course they can't tell you what sort of death. It sounds strange, but we spent a lot of time searching areas, perhaps unnecessarily, for what turned out to be dead foxes, dead rabbits, dead cats, rats, you name it. We found it because the dogs were finding death. They were asked to find death, and they were doing their job. They couldn't help the fact that it wasn't the human death that we were looking for. But we did a lot of searching with those guys and girls, and very, very good at their job, certainly. We also went to the guy's house where Zalkan had been living, because don't forget, he was still missing. And in fact, at this point, I think the owner of the house, that paedophile, was actually back in prison now for other offences. So his house was searched literally inch by inch, top to bottom. And they turned up a couple of interesting things there. The first thing that the police search teams found, now don't forget, there's hundreds of sort of trained search officers within the Met, but they're quite often part-time, and they do like a 2-week rotation perhaps on search teams, so that there is always at least 2 sort of full-time search teams available 24 hours a day to the Met, because obviously it's such a busy place with a lot going on. It takes a while to mobilise officers if they're not permanently in those roles. So all those hundreds of officers took their turn and did a couple of weeks at a time where they were based on those teams, ready to go. And of course, those permanent teams were used all the time for this search. And they were very busy. And they're fantastic at what they do. The level of search they go to is unbelievable, down to SIM cards and similar, even in huge areas. Very, very good at what they do. But they actually had a really good find at the house, and this shows you the level. If you can imagine, a concrete path that leads down the side of a house, at the edge of that path between the house and the concrete path, there was a small gap. Now this gap was, I don't know, not even 1 centimetre, maybe 2 centimetres wide, something like that. And it was, 100 foot long or something, this path. These guys and girls were so dedicated, they were on their hands and knees going along, fingertipping along this path. And that takes some resilience, because, that would probably take them a complete day just to do that path, even swapping out the teams. It's hard work, on your knees and your back and what have you. But these guys actually turned up a phone case that had been dropped down it was an iPhone case that had been dropped down this tiny little crack at the edge of this path. And they found it, and it later turned out to be Alice's phone. And that was the first real link that definitely showed we were on the right track. Around about the same time, a DNA result came back from a cigarette butt that was found by Alice's backpack that was on the side of the River Brent. And that DNA also came back to Zalkan. So again, we knew that we were after the right person, on the right track. And the other strange thing that was found at the house was, and we ended up diving it, of all things, it was in the back garden. It was quite a large detached property in a busy area in West London, had a big long garden that was, I don't know, 50, 100 feet long, something like that. And they found a hatch. The search teams found a hatch in the back garden. When they lifted it, it was just a hole in the ground, but they were pretty confident it went into some sort of chamber. Now that chamber was flooded, filled up almost to the top with water. So they called us in as the dive team, and we went down into it. It was a very narrow entrance. And I must admit, I was convinced we were going to find her in there. I thought for sure this is where we're going to find her body. But one of the guys went in, and it was so narrow, he couldn't get through the entrance. He was a skinny guy anyway, and he couldn't get through the entrance to get into this dive chamber with his dive cylinders on his back. So in the end, he went in on scuba with a line attached to him, but he had to have the cylinders off his back and effectively carry them. And he got in first, and then the cylinders were handed down to him. All the while he's on air and attached with his mask on, breathing off those cylinders. The cylinders were then passed to him through the hole, and he then put the cylinders on and carried out the dive. Now, the actual chamber, when you were in there, wasn't that big. But I think it was something like 8 feet deep, and it opened out into a big sort of bowl effect, but was completely submerged. And it only took him kind of 5 minutes to search it, because it was relatively small. But Still don't really know the purpose of that, you know, whether there was an intention, perhaps, one day to conceal someone or something in there and it had flooded, so the idea was given up. I don't know, but certainly it was searched and yeah, she wasn't in there. As I say, I was pretty convinced that she was going to be at some point. I couldn't come up with a, you know, valid reason of why you would have a hole like that in your back garden. But yes, so she wasn't there, so continued on. And it was around about this time, we were some weeks into the search. Everyone was getting pretty tired. Like I say, we've been at it 7 days a week with just the odd day off. Yeah, I think everyone was feeling it was very hot. And I'd been to have some food at this you know, Teapot One and the place we talked about where they were providing the food. And I was diving in the afternoon, having had lunch. And I remember it quite well because I had sausages, and I was mid-dive, and I was feeling a bit sick, which is unusual, really quite nauseous. Now, when you're diving, obviously that's not great, as you can imagine. With a sport rig, you know, a regulator you put in your mouth and you breathe your air that way, you actually technically can be sick into those, and it will filter away and you can carry on breathing. I mean, it would be really unpleasant, but you could do it. Now, we wore full face masks that entirely covered our face so that our mouth and nose was clear to to breathe. And again, if you were sick into there, you could probably clear it out, but it would be pretty unpleasant. So I carried on the dive for half an hour or so, got to the point where I thought, I really am going to be sick here. And I had to surface and call the dive and said, I'm sorry, I don't feel well. So I was dragged over to the side, taken out, sent back to the truck. And within about half an hour, I was being sick in the truck. And then I remember I had a horrible journey back to the base, about 2 or 3 hours in traffic, in the heat, driving back across central London with me, basically sitting on the toilet in the dive truck, being sick. And it was just horrible, not just being sick either, coming out of both ends. You know, I'm sure I don't have to paint the picture for you, but very, very unpleasant, almost certainly food poisoning. But I was dragged back to the base and pretty much thrown on a mattress on the office floor and then left there overnight. And by the following day, apart from being very dehydrated, you know, I felt, you know, well enough to continue on. So we headed back out and carried on with the diving. But really, really unpleasant few hours for sure. Yes, I won't forget that in a hurry. Really, really nasty. So meanwhile, we'd headed back to the same location. And in fact, we'd now been sent back to the River Brent. If you remember, we were searching by the backpack, and we got about 3/4 of the way through this search, but hadn't completed it. And now virtually 4 weeks had passed since she'd gone missing, and huge areas had been searched. We'd searched loads more stuff, but we'd moved back to this River Brent to continue the search near where the backpack was. I think we'd really pushed, the bosses had really pushed, we need to start finishing all these spots. It's all right kind of flitting from one to the other because of new information and evidence. But those areas still got a question mark over them. You can't rule them out until you get back and actually complete that search. The big problem with the River Brent where it was that there was a lot of fallen trees across the river. And in fact, 2 of our guys had been searching under things where trees had moved. And there was some real concern that, you know, the trees would either come down on the diver or across his airline, you know, tangle his airline or something like that. So we spoke to our colleagues in the fire brigade who have access to chainsaws, and actually they worked with us and were moving. They were in dry suits ahead of us, cutting the fallen trees. And then sawing them into sort of manageable logs before they were then moving them out of the river and clearing the way ahead of the dive team. Now, actually, this particular afternoon, or it might have been early evening, I wasn't with the team. I think this was one of the rare occasions that, you know, I'd been given a day off. As I say, we rotated round and everyone got some time off just to try and, recoup a bit. And this was one of those occasions where I wasn't with the team. I think at this time as well, we'd split the team as well. So there were some people diving in the morning, some in the afternoon, and it was almost like 2 shifts within our team. So this was sort of half the team were out helping, and fire brigade were working ahead of us. I say us, you know, the royal us, the team. And one of the fire brigade guys tripped over this big pile of logs in the river that were on the bottom. And he assumed that it was part of the logs that they had already cut up, you know, that had sort of floated down the river and settled on the bottom. So he reached down and started clearing this log pile from the riverbed. It was about waist deep in water, and maybe a little bit shallower, and started sort of throwing these logs onto the shore from his pow. And as he got through this pile, a sort of pyramid pile of logs, he then found a bike wheel. And this bike wheel seemed to have, he pulled it out, it seemed to have bricks sort of attached to it that had been wired into it to weight it down. So he moved that as well, trying to be helpful in fairness. And when he reached down, then he felt something soft that didn't feel right, that felt out of place. And when he, felt a bit closer, he realised that he was actually touching a human elbow and a sort of upper arm. So he leapt out the water and kind of told the dive team, who moved down to the location, and continued on with taking off the various things. And sure enough, this was poor Alice in the river. And so she'd had these logs on her. Her body had been put into bin bags. She'd been wrapped up in the sort of fetal position with this bike wheel on top, with the bricks and the tree trunks all piled up on her. And so her body was recovered from the river. The end of a very unpleasant search. But a few things happened after that, which are sort of worthy of note. Firstly, initially, we didn't want to tell the press that we had found her body. So it was agreed that it would be kept absolutely tight within the team. No one would speak to anyone. No one would tell anybody about it, because that's where we were in the investigation. And then to our horror, the following day, the details, and I'm talking about the real details that I've just described to you, logs, bike wheel, the whole thing, absolutely crucial to an investigation when it comes to a court case. If that stuff's been put out in the press, sure enough, that all appeared in the paper the following day. So we were really unhappy about it. We knew it hadn't come from our team, and there was only one other team on that bank at the time. So we were very, very disappointed, to say the least, and that's putting it lightly. We were pretty confident we knew where the leak to the press was. Really, really hacked off, quite frankly. One thing it did mean is that going forward, all of us had chainsaw training and the ability to clear our own logs and trees from rivers, etc. We went away and did a week's course and got our own sets of protective kit and chainsaws, so that any work like that in future could be done by just the team, and it could all be kept in-house, so that no one else was involved, because we really trusted our team to keep things tight if that's what needed to be done. So that was terrible, and of course it was going to come out eventually, but for the family that must have been particularly upsetting, I suspect. So Zalcans is still outstanding at this point, and the search continued on for him. Initially, the feeling was that he'd probably left the country. They were, pretty confident he was the offender at this point. But as I say, he disappeared a week after Alice had gone missing. So that was now we were now at least 4 weeks on from that, really, and the search continued for him. And then eventually on October the 4th, bearing in mind that Alice went missing 28th of August, on October the 4th, Zalcans was found in a park in West London. He was hanging from a tree. Certainly looks like he'd killed himself around about a week after she first went missing. And he'd been hanging for some time. I mean, that whole time, we believe it was in a really, really rough area of woods that no one had actually searched up until that point. And sure enough, it was one of the dogs that had smelt him out, and then the handler went across and had a look and realised what was going on. And one very strange thing was that, physically his neck, because he'd been hanging so long, had been stretched beyond belief. His actual neck ended up being about sort of 2 foot long because he'd been hanging from this tree. Now, I know I'm getting pretty gruesome here, but in most cases that I've come across like that, they end up kind of being decapitated. But actually he'd stayed intact apart from this very long neck. So it was a bit strange to see, to say the least. So that brought to an end not only the investigation, but also obviously the search for poor Alice. And it was decided, it went through obviously coroner's court, and it was decided that basically had Zalcans been alive, he would have been charged with Alice's murder. There was enough evidence, more than enough evidence, to sort of put that to him. But obviously the fact that he was now dead meant that wasn't going to happen. But basically, the police, did their sort of classic thing of saying, no, we're not looking for anyone else in relation to this investigation, which is a clear indication that we absolutely think it was him. So yeah, poor Alice. It was a very tough search over a number of weeks, very hot conditions, and we all really wanted to find her and get a result. But we also realistically knew, what the result was going to be. And then it was hopefully a case of getting hold of whoever had done that to her, which we did, but he was never to see justice, unfortunately. Or maybe he did, it depends on your take. But there we go. So I hope you found that interesting. There'll be another one next week. Please continue listening and passing it on to whoever you think might be interested. And we'll speak again soon. Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.